The subject of this video is the first chapter of Jean-Luc Marion's God Without Being, this book right here in its English translation, which is entitled The Idol and the Icon. So we're going to be talking about how these concepts of the idol and the icon are developed by Marion, and they are developed, of course, phenomenologically, and we're all familiar with that by now. So we're going to be approaching a phenomenology of the idol and the icon and trying to prepare ourselves for, in the following videos, to understand the way in which these concepts help to inform Marion's aesthetics and philosophy of art. So let's begin. Now, one of the first statements that Marion makes is that the idol can be approached only in the antagonism that unites it with the icon. And one can presume vice versa, that the icon can be approached only in the antagonism that unites it with the idol. And so we're going to try to keep track. We'll keep a running tally here. We'll see how this goes. Comparing the idol and the icon on my trusty brand new whiteboard. Thank you, Amazon.com. So, first, a little bit of background. Especially in Eastern Christianity, prayer before icons has long been a venerated tradition. Now, theologically, the icon is not merely a picture or a reminder of what Christ or a saint supposedly looked like. Rather, icons are viewed as something like, and I use this term in scare quotes, something like a window into a spiritual reality. Now, on the other hand, the Hebrew Bible, of course, is very heavy on the insistence on avoiding graven images and the worship of physical objects as gods. Even the golden calf, which is meant to be a kind of symbolic representation of Yahweh, we find there's, obviously a deep prohibition against that and punishment that befalls the Israelites for doing that. So there's always been this tension, especially in Eastern Christianity, between, on the one hand, the functional role of icons and the prohibition against idols. And this forms an important part of the background of Marion's chapter. Historically, and you can access good historical accounts of this, brief accounts, probably YouTube videos. This erupted into a controversy in the Byzantine Empire, the so-called iconoclasm controversies, in which political and religious authorities for a time challenged the use of icons. So this is a long and very detailed history, in both as a matter of art history and religious history, and it's weighted with a lot of theological conceptions. And Marion is trying to deal with a central question that arises here, which is, what's the difference between an idol and an icon? And how is it possible, if they are different, how is it possible for them to so easily slide the one into the other? Historically, the idol and the icon have been intertwined concepts, and their distinctness has on occasion been vigorously asserted and on other occasions been vigorously challenged. So something about the idol and the icon itself must make it possible to have this kind of relationship between the two. Okay. So the two concepts are rooted in Greek words. He mentions these in their relation to Jewish monotheism and Greek polytheism. We're not going to worry too much about the philology of the words idol and icon here, but I'm happy to go into it to the extent that I'm able to for those of you with an interest, and I know some of you have backgrounds in Greek and you might want to contribute in the discussion box by talking about the philological issues that relate to those, and that's fine. But I'm not going to say a lot about that here. Now, a superficial understanding of the essential relation between the idol and the icon would regard them as basically divided by what kinds of objects they are, right? What two different kinds of beings. The idol is one kind of being, and the icon is another type of being. And perhaps in art history, it might be tempting to try to give a stylistic account, saying that, well, if you have an idol, it's got this sort of a style. One might argue, perhaps a more figurally realistic style, rather, versus, let's say, a more, self-consciously or in its presentation, presenting itself as something that is not very physical or literally realistic, for example. But Marion rejects this kind of art's historical, stylistic analysis. He doesn't think that this is the way that we're going to be able to distinguish between the idol and the icon. It's not as if you could, you can put it this way. It's not as if you could program a computer and give a list of characteristics of idols and a list of characteristics of icons and program a computer to be able to pick out the idols and the icons and sort them one into the other. It's not going to work. So it's not just a conflict between two models of art. Rather, at a deeper level, it's a conflict between two phenomenologies. So a phenomenology in this sense would be the way in which something presents itself or makes itself visible, presents itself to consciousness. Or in a more technical way, we could describe this as the way in which it is intended, right? That's the phenomenological sense of intend. We'll add a hyphen here just to emphasize that we're not talking here about my purposes or my plans or something like that, but the way in which the mind points towards. Right? That's the technical phenomenological notion of intentionality that many of you will be very familiar with. We're not talking about anything beyond the way in which different objects are intended or the way in which they satisfy or fulfill or fail to fulfill those intentions. So that's the phenomenological approach that Marion is going to further here. Idol and icon don't designate particular types of beings. They don't designate two different types of things, but rather, as he would put it, a manner of being for beings, a manner of being. This has an important implication. One and the same object, one and the same thing, one and the same being can be either an idol or an icon, depending upon how it is intended or how my consciousness is directed towards it, or, as we'll see, how its intention is directed towards me. But we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves. But that's going to be one of the important factors that makes the distinction. Okay. Also, Marion makes clear that he's not interested in making a demarcation between the true and the false gods. So it's not a purely religious, spiritual, or theological matter either that we're dealing with here. We can't just say, well, both idols and icons are representations of gods, and if they're a representation of the true God, then they're good, they're an icon. And if they're a representation of false gods, pagan gods, then they're an idol. He's not going to have anything to do with that kind of a sort of chauvinistic understanding of the distinction. In fact, he makes a point of saying, this is on page 8, by the way, of our translation, if you want a reference, that the Greeks can't be dismissed as pure and simple idolatry. It just simply isn't the case that the Greeks didn't have a real approach to the divine. So Marion here isn't advocating some kind of exclusivist theology, if you're not familiar with that term. By exclusivism, we mean the view that typically in the case of one of the Abrahamic religions, one asserts that this God, my God, is the only God. It's the exclusive God, and any other purported gods are not gods at all. They're idols. That's not what he's talking about here. In fact, it's very clear he sees there a kind of continuity here between the way in which the Greeks approached, say, the statuary and the temples, and the way in which the Eastern Orthodox Christian in particular, will approach an icon. So again, idol and icon are not two separate classes of being, since the same beings can pass from one to the other. Okay, so if this is the case, then how do we account for their interference with one another? That's a very important question to deal with. Now, not every being can pass from idol to icon and vice versa. That's the starting point we have to start from. We have to acknowledge that not everything can be an idol or an icon. You know, this book is not going to be a candidate to be an idol or an icon. My dry erase marker here is not going to be a candidate to be an idol or an icon. So what makes things candidates to be idols or icons? And what he says is what all these beings have in common, so here's another common element, is that they are signa concerning the divine. Signa, and of course you see here the root of sign, signa concerning the divine. This notion is very close to, or is intertwined, I would say, with the discussion of the symbol. We were looking at Gadamer earlier, so you might refer back to that. The idea is that both of these are not merely representations or indications of something external to them, but both idol and icon contain something, Marion describes it as their own essential dignity that concerns a kind of presence. That's what the signa here is. It's a kind of presence of the divine. And you remember when we were discussing the symbol in Gadamer, we talked about the idea of the symbolon, which is this sort of, like, a typical example would be something like a medallion that is cracked in half and then can be fit together. So that each part is something that it has its own integrity, its own essential dignity, but it also refers to something beyond itself that it can be fit together with. And he's very much, I think, conceiving of the necessary condition of both idol and icon in those terms. So they both have this character of a signa. Okay. So the divine also comes into play in both cases only with the support of a visibility. So that's going to be another common feature that we could mark here that fits on both sides, is some kind of relation to visibility. Now, as we're going to see, there's a very different relationship in both of these cases. And it gets a little bit complex. But nonetheless, you're not going to have either an idol or an icon without some kind of visibility. And this is entirely what we should expect from phenomenology. There couldn't be a phenomenological analysis of idols and icons if there wasn't some visibility in play here. So it's going to be the variations in the mode of visibility that indicate variations in the mode of apprehension of the divine itself. So you can think here about, say, a classic example. We're talking, if you go back, let's say, to Hegel's aesthetics. Hegel talks a lot about the presentation of the absolute in the statuary in Greek temples, and the idea of sort of the rational embodied form of the idea is embodied in the god who is in the temple, or goddess, as the case may be. Now, that's a very different conception of the divine from, let's say, a modern Rothko painting or something like that, where you have this sort of evocation of, usually considered to be a form of the sublime, something that takes us beyond what we can see, a seeing that takes us beyond our seeing. So in both those cases, we have visibility, but it's a very different kind of visibility, and the conception or the apprehension, maybe a better word, of the divine is relative to those different forms of visibility. So the manner of seeing decides what could be seen, or at least negatively what could not be perceived of the divine. That's another important point that Marion makes. Okay. So first, the first section is called First Visible, beginning on page 9. So let's go through this one. A couple points. The idol is not illusory. This is a false denunciation of the idol. It's false to say that the idol is just an illusion. It's got its own phenomenology. And there are some limitations to this phenomenology that could form the basis of a critique of the idol, but to say it's an illusion is not one of them. Okay, there's something real that comes to presence, and in fact, paradigmatically is present. It is kind of the acme of presence in a lot of ways, as we'll see. So it's not accurate phenomenologically to say that it's just an illusion. By definition, it's something that is seen. One cannot but see it. It is so visible that the very act of seeing it By the very act of seeing it, one knows it. By the very act of seeing it, one knows it. This might remind us of what Gadamer at the end of Truth and Methods said about the beautiful. The beautiful is sort of truth just presenting itself, or knowledge just presenting itself with a kind of immediacy. Here he's saying in the idol, the very act of seeing it is a form of knowing. In other words, you don't need to conceptualize in order to know. There's a kind of immediacy of intuition in the idol that makes the idol a kind of paradigm of knowing. It's not something that, as it were, is a deficient form of knowing, but rather it's the paradigm. It's the immediate intuition that we get in the idol. And in fact, the root meaning of the term eidolon relates to the idea of seeing. Okay, so now we're up to an important notion that again belongs to both, and that is this familiar term to those of you who know some French philosophy, the idea of the gaze. The gaze. So this is a very theoretically weighted notion in modern French philosophy. It plays an important theoretical role in Jean-Paul Sartre and Jacques Lacan, in Michel Foucault, and in Derrida. Some of you might be acquainted with it through film and gender studies, where it's been particularly influential. And in general, let's put it this way. If I say that X gazes at Y, that implies, in the usual way in this philosophical tradition of understanding what the gaze is, some kind of form of domination. For X to gaze at Y, X dominates Y. So there's a power imbalance between the gazer and the object of the gaze. And this is very much related to the function of objectification that is familiar to us even from a colloquial or common sense way. See, I'm going to have to get a bigger eraser here so I can be a little bit more efficient. But anyway, in general, for X to gaze at Y implies this asymmetric power relation in which X has some degree of control or domination over Y, in the sense typically that Y is understood as an object for X. And conversely, to feel oneself to be the object of a gaze is to feel oneself objectified, to feel oneself subordinated, to feel oneself to be under someone else's control. So how does the gaze figure into Marion's analysis of the idol? He says, first of all, that the idol fascinates and captivates the gaze precisely because everything in it must expose itself to the gaze, attract it, fill it, and hold it. So we can add a few things here to our list of characteristics of the idol and the icon. Oops. One is this notion that the idol fascinates the gaze. It fascinates the gaze. Why does it fascinate the gaze? Because it is exposed to the gaze, and not just partially, but everything in it is exposed to the gaze. It fascinates the gaze because everything in it is exposed to the gaze. So there is a sense in which one could say that the idol holds the gaze captive. But the priority here is still very much on the side of the gaze. It's because of the way in which the idol is exposed to the gaze that the gaze is able to be held captive. So the idol-gaze relation is one that ultimately, I think it's fair to say, depends upon the priority of the gaze, right? So we can even add that to this discussion of the idol, that the gaze is prior, and in a certain sense, this might be too strong, so some of you in the comment section can challenge this or add some qualifications if you so choose. But I'm going to say here that the gaze is prior and it constitutes the idol. It's my gaze that's intending, that's looking for something visible that ultimately makes the idol. And he'll give various justifications for that later on. But his basic view is, and now we're in the transition between page 11 and page 10 and page 11, if you want textual anchors for this. On page 11, he's clear that the gaze precedes the idol. The aim, the intention, in that phenomenological sense of intend, precedes that at which it aims. So what does it aim at? Well, we're talking about idols, right? So it aims at the divine. The divine is always going to be what's at issue here in idols as well as in icons. It intends the divine and it stops at the idol. He uses this strange term on page 11 that the gaze no longer transpierces itself. It no longer pierces things, but it rests in one of them. And we can discuss exactly what is meant by this, but to me it evokes this idea that the way we typically go about our business, we see things. You know, I get up in the morning and brush my teeth or make breakfast or make coffee or whatever the case may be. And I'm not really paying attention, right? I have my morning routine. I see things, I manipulate them, I use them. That my gaze transpierces things. I'm not actually really focusing on things very much. It's not that I'm oblivious to them either. Of course, I have to be able to be seeing them in some sense, right? Otherwise, I would just trip over everything. But my gaze is transpiercing things. But if I have an idol in my house, you know, if I'm a kind of a religious person that actually worships some idol that I have, let's say, in the center of my house, when that idol is there, I'm going to be not just transpiercing it with my gaze, right? I'm going to be reverencing it. I'm going to be sort of showing my devotion to it in some ways. I'm going to be behaving respectfully towards it. You know, maybe it's in a special room and I don't go in that room except for certain times of the day and so forth. So you get the idea. There's a difference between the gaze that is fixed and frozen, as he will later say, in the idol, and the way in which our gaze normally transpierces our surroundings. At any rate, that's the way that I'm understanding this, and if you have a different perspective, I'd love to hear it. Okay, the second section on the invisible mirror. Here, Jean-Luc Marion turns to the interpretation of the appearance of the idol. So when the idol appears, the gaze has stopped. And this basically is another aspect of this idea of fascinating the gaze. There are a lot of different ways in which he describes this. He describes it as stopping, halting, freezing, satisfying, holding, right? But it's all basically, I think, the same kind of idea. And behind this is the idea of a kind of fulfillment of our intention. So our intention, our intuition exactly matches our preconception. The idol corresponds to a God that we can grasp. It's adequate. It's perfect. Our God is perfectly represented in the idol. It is the idol in some sense. You have to be careful with that. But that seems to be the basic idea. You know, when we're dealing with things like here I have, since it's allergy season, and not so as not to have any emergencies, I have some extra Kleenex here in case I have to sneeze. And, you know, this is not a perfect piece of Kleenex. There is no such thing as a perfect piece of Kleenex. Our idea of a piece of Kleenex is something that always goes beyond any particular thing that we could intuit. It's not completely satisfied by any particular piece of Kleenex as if this were the be-all and end-all of Kleenex. Or I guess I should say tissues. So the idol has a different characteristic in that it does seem to satisfy our intention, what we're looking for, what we're conscious of. It's not disposable. It's not interchangeable. It has its own irreducible dignity that can't be exchanged for anything else. It doesn't have an exchange value in that sense. Okay? So that's one important aspect of this. The second, and this here we actually do need to add something, because this takes a further step beyond what we said so far, I think. And that is, in the sense of the idol, we're talking about a phenomenon that mirrors the gaze. And he refines this a little bit. It mirrors the gaze in the sense that it mirrors the scope, he'll say, of the gaze. In the gaze, in the idol, the gaze rather discovers its own limit and its own proper place. And the idol thus acts as a mirror that reflects the gaze's image, or more exactly, its aim and the scope of that aim. This is what I'm aiming at. That's on page 12. Now here, I might want to connect this with, if you go back to our discussion of Kristeva and the Lacanian background, Lacan's understanding. I hear my cat destroying the furniture over there, so hopefully he'll stop soon. But the idea, remember, of the ideal ego, the object in the mirror stage that reflects to me a kind of wholeness and integrity that I'm not aware of myself having from the perspective of my consciousness. You know, my consciousness is just this sort of flighty monkey brain succession of impressions and thoughts and so on, that's easily distracted by cats destroying furniture in the other room or whatever the case may be. And so when I look at myself, for example, in my video reflection here, I see a kind of wholeness and integrity that I don't have in my consciousness. So you'll recall that as being part of this Lacanian idea of the ideal ego, or how it develops in this mirror stage, in the infantile stage of human development. And if you connect that, it'd be interesting to connect this with what Marion is saying about the idol, because the idol sort of presents itself as a kind of ideal fulfillment of the mirroring that typically we only incompletely find. Another connection here that fits with both Lacan, I think, and Marion's understanding is the way in which people can idolize, let's say, a love interest, right, or the idea of a sex object, right? Someone who you're madly in love with, who you feel is going to, make you complete in some sense, right? This reflection: if only this person loved me, then I would feel like my life has worth and value. That other person out there, outside of me, right? That's what I was always looking for. My gaze is satisfied when I gaze upon that person. I'm fascinated because that person is so beautiful. That kind of idea. Okay, so the idol mirrors the gaze in this sense. It gives a sense of fulfillment of what the gaze is aiming at. Phenomenologically, he adds some concepts to this that you can make more or less out of depending upon how useful you find them. I'm not going to write them down here, but I'm going to mention them, and you can open up the transcript of this video later on to collect them if you so choose. But of course, they're also very prominent in the text. One is the idea of the dazzling character. It dazzles me, right? It sort of fills my senses and overpowers my senses, such that I'm not interested in anything else. When I'm in the presence of the idol, my god, my goddess, nothing else, the world melts away around me. Nothing else matters, nothing else distracts me, nothing else interests me. So that's the dazzling character. But I'm completely filled, right? So it would be the sort of visual analogy to how you feel after Thanksgiving dinner. You're just stuffed. Your visual apparatus is just stuffed with the idol in its appearance. And connected to this, he also speaks of ravishment. So there's this sense of just almost to the point of pain being overcome by these visual sensations and the brilliance of it. So there's a sense of the imagery of a very bright light that is almost painful to behold, but just fills your visual field so completely that nothing else has a place in there anymore. And this freezes the gaze as the gaze settles on this brilliant, dazzling, ravishing thing. Now, there's another aspect of this. So there's visibility, but there's also an invisible character to it. And he coins this neologism here, not invisible, but invisable. The invisable is not just what cannot appear or become visible, but that which cannot even be aimed at. So the idol doesn't allow for an invisible, but only an invisable. What does that mean? There's nothing more to want. I can't aim at anything beyond the idol because it already gives me everything I've aimed at. It's this sense of a kind of completely present fulfillment. So there's nothing to aim at beyond it in that sense. But there's another kind of invisible, and that's the invisible that has to do with the very fact of it mirroring my own gaze. That's invisible to me, according to Marion. It's masked. That I'm not aware of the fact that I'm really just sort of projecting myself, right? And that's also a very classical and very biblical conception of the idol, that when mortals erect idols, we're really erecting something like a version of ourselves to worship. And but that's not something that we typically recognize, right? Because otherwise we wouldn't see it as being other and divine and beyond us. So the idol, in that respect, limits the divine. And now we're into the third section, which is on page 14. It consigns it, Marion says, to the measure of the human gaze. Consigns it to the measure of the human gaze. So I'm going to get rid of this invisible. Oops. And I sure hope there aren't more things I need to write down here because I'm definitely at the bottom of the board now. But it consigns the divine to human measure. And you can think here in particular of Ludwig Feuerbach, who I think we've mentioned in class before. But the idea that Feuerbach had is that God is just a kind of projection of human qualities, right? It's something that definitely fits within the human measure of what's achievable. And the idea would be that God just fully realizes or perfects human qualities. So God, if human beings have the capacity to, let's say, be selfless, then what is God? Well, God is perfectly selfless. If human beings have the power to be courageous, then God is sort of perfectly fearless or courageous, etc. You get the point. So now Marion doesn't mean exactly that, but what he does mean is that whatever the structure of our gaze is based on, and again, what you view it being based on is going to partly depend upon your philosophy. But let's say, you're a Lacanian and you're viewing it as partly constituted by these psychological mechanisms. Then the idol is going to be limited by those mechanisms. It's going to be limited by whatever is responsible for the human gaze. Okay, so we're consigning the divine to that. Now, in this third section on dazzling return, he talks about the role of the material. What role does material play? Obviously, we're talking about things that have a relationship to works of art, and art has a material basis. So what is the idol in material terms? How does Marion account for this? Well, the artist, he says, wants to solidify an ultimate visible where his gaze froze. The fixed figure is to occupy the place of the frozen gaze. That's page 14. The aim of this is to provide the spectator with the brilliance that first fixed the gaze. Now, I think the most important aspect of his analysis here is that it still is really the gaze, whether it is of the artist or the memory of the artist, or whether it is of the spectator, that is responsible for constituting the idol. Right? That was this point here, that the gaze is prior to and constitutes the idol. But the material is supposed to provide a kind of medium whereby the gaze of the spectator can be evoked, and the gaze of the artist, or the artist's experience of the brilliance and the freezing of his or her gaze can be memorialized and sort of preserved, recorded, you might say. So that's the role he apparently sees here of the material basis for the idol. And so, again, this stands to point out his earlier point that idols and icons are not things. They have a material basis, but their being comes from the gaze. Okay. Let's go to section 4 then. The conceptual idol. This is a little bit beside the point. If this was a class on modern Christian thought or theology or philosophy of religion or something like that, or even just pure continental philosophy, we might spend more time on this. But since our interest is more on the aesthetic side, this serves mainly as a kind of point of contrast. Marion wants to make the point that it's not just aesthetic objects or works of art that can be idols or icons, but that in both cases there's a conceptual idol or a conceptual icon that's also possible. So we can have concepts that function as idols. And here he connects what I was mentioning earlier, Feuerbach's idea of God. That would be an example of something that was an idol, where we're basically erecting the idea of a perfect human being up as a concept of God. That's a conceptual idol. But more generally, he connects metaphysical concepts of God, such as the causa sui, the self-caused cause, the first cause, or the moral author of the world, a Kantian phrase, the idea of the moral God, famously criticized by Nietzsche. These would be conceptual idols of God. But we don't need to spend too much time on that. But I note that as a further broadening and extension of this concept of the idol and of the icon beyond the purely aesthetic aspect of it. All right, so let's just review this one more time. So the icon then fascinates the gaze. Everything in it is exposed to the gaze. The gaze is prior to and constitutes the idol. It mirrors the gaze, and the idol consigns the divine to human measure. I think that covers basically some of the most important points. If there are additional ones that you think belong on here, you want to discuss and that are distinct from these, that would be a great thing for you to do and to comment on in the comments section. So let's move on to the icon. What's over here? What's on this side? So one of the points he makes here is that the icon does not result from a vision, but provokes one. So here we can say, I'm not really sure where this should go. It seems like what he wants to say here is something like the icon is prior and constitutes the gaze. Right? So whereas the idol is, in the idol, the gaze is prior and constitutes the idol. In the icon is prior and constitutes the gaze. That seems to be this idea. The relations to visibility are also very different. In the case of the idol, we talked about everything being exposed to the gaze, right? Here we want to say that not everything is exposed to the gaze. So it's precisely the reverse, right? Where in the case of the idol, everything's exposed to the gaze, and the icon, everything's not exposed to the gaze. What does that mean? Well, he initially uses this interesting example of Achilles in Homer. In Achilles, something characteristic of the gods rises to visibility, but no god becomes visible. Achilles doesn't become the idol in his own right, but there's something divine about him. In Achilles' actions, little by little, the invisible divine rises to visibility, but never completely. It never becomes completely present. It never becomes completely exposed in the way it does in the idol. There's always something held back. Similarly, he talks about, moving into the Christian context, he talks about St. Paul's view of Christ as the icon of the invisible God. The icon of the invisible God. Christ is the visibility of the invisible God. Something of God's nature shines through Christ's humanity, but not all of it, not completely. It's not something where you could say in Christ God is completely present. At least that's the view that Marion is reading from St. Paul here. So an icon is not really of the visible, but in a certain sense of the invisible. It's a matter of rendering the visible, he even says at one point, uninvisageable. That's on page 17. But the icon does attempt to render visible the invisible as such. And here's the great problem. The icon attempts to render visible the invisible as such. I'm not really sure that fits exactly into any of these, so I'm not going to put it down. But I will repeat it again because it really frames the problem. If the icon is supposed to render visible the invisible as such, isn't the icon just a inherently impossible being or appearance or project, however you want to characterize it, intention, aim? How can the invisible be rendered visible? It seems like a contradiction. It sounds just like contradictory nonsense, doesn't it? So how are we going to make sense of this? And here is the key idea. It's the relation to the gaze. And this one I'm going to put in comparison to, let's see, which one do I want to put it? This one or this one? The icon summons the gaze to surpass itself. I'm going to put this here on the front one, although it might equally be parallel to the bottom one. We'll see. And the reason I put it up here is it seems parallel to this idea that if the idol fascinates the gaze, right, it holds the gaze, it stops. It stops the gaze. It says halt. The icon, right, isn't the red light of the idol saying stop, but it's a green light saying go beyond. But it's more than even that, because it's summons, it's calling you to go beyond, right? So that seems to be an important contrast that's constitutive of the idol-icon distinction. And to explain this, Marion turns to the concept from Levinas. We'll temporarily write this in here. Levinas's concept of the face. Some of you will be familiar with Levinas, Emmanuel Levinas, and the concept of the face. Just very briefly, how is this relevant here? What is the face? For Levinas, and this is very crudely, very sort of rough and ready, but for Levinas, the face is the basis of ethics, essentially. Think about when you see a human being and you see their face appealing to you, what do you see? You see a being that has a moral claim on you. You see a being that essentially is immediately telling you, don't kill me. You know, don't hurt me, don't harm me. I am other. And that's another connection that Levinas makes. The face is what presents us with what is other than us. You know, I can look around and maybe I have pictures on the wall and my property around here and so on. And I can look at this and I can sort of just see a reflection of myself. I see, well, that's my stuff. We talked about this also when we were talking about the ideal ego, right? How someone can try to find fulfillment in stuff. My car is a kind of stereotypical example, right? That's me. But if I view, let's say, my spouse or my friends as just like, you know, what's my entourage or something, you know, or a trophy, I'm not seeing them as other. I'm seeing them as just an extension of myself. And some people, of course, see their children that way. They see them as just extensions of themselves, right, to fulfill their dreams or whatever. So Levinas is saying, look, this is phenomenologically basic. We encounter the other when we encounter the face of the other. But what is the face? And here the important question to ask is the face visible? And in a way, I mean, depending on what you mean by visible, the answer would be sort of yes and no. In a literal physical sense, of course, you can say, well, that person's face is different from that other person's face. I'm sure, there are many people whose face you'd rather be looking at right now than mine. And that's in the physical sense, right? There's certain characteristics that my face has that other people's faces don't have and so forth. But in this phenomenological sense, the face, what makes just this sort of skeletal structure with muscle tissue and skin and so on into a face is that there's something invisible behind it. We might say, roughly speaking, that you see this. You see this skeletal structure and this muscle and skin as expressive of a person, expressive of an other, someone that's other than you, right? And that has ethical demands on you, and so forth. So that's this idea of there being a kind of invisibility that appears phenomenologically. It's paradoxically, it's a paradoxical sounding idea, but I think it connects to something we actually experience. You experience me not just as a collection of skeletal, structure and various types of flesh and tissue, but you experience me as a person, as a face, as an other, right? And that's an invisible element that goes beyond what's merely visible. And so we could, in general, we'll just stick this down here. We could say that the icon shows a face, whereas the idol mirrors the gaze, mirrors me back to myself. The idol shows a face. And maybe we'll put some scare quotes on there, and maybe a little L in parentheses here to remind us we're talking about this Levinasian vision I was just talking about, okay? And a face is in this sense the opposite of the mirror. So here the paradox or the contradiction seems to be resolved. The invisible of the icon is not the invisible of the idol or a pure nothing. It's the invisible of a face, of the face. And infinity is part of the story here. There's a kind of infinite depth that lies beneath the face. So what does that mean? Does that mean that my mind is infinite, I'm God when you're looking at me? No, it doesn't mean this at all. But what it means is that you might know me very well. Maybe we've been friends since, we were 5 years old or something like that. If anyone happens to stumble across this, who I haven't seen in a while, who knew me in kindergarten, hi. I used to have hair. But anyway, so, we might have been friends for a very long time. You might know me very well. And you might even think that you could completely predict all of my moves. You could really predict all of my choices. If we went out to eat in a restaurant, you could pick, hopefully we'll be able to go out to eat in restaurants again at some point. You'd be able to completely predict what I was going to eat and so forth, right? But the fact is, you can't. You can't ever put a person, no matter how close of a friend, a spouse that someone's been married to for 75 years, you can't ever put them in your back pocket in that way, right? There's a kind of infinite depth. Now, maybe Levinas, I'm not an expert or scholar of Levinas, I don't want to pretend to be, and he very likely means other things beyond that. For example, the infinite worth and value and dignity of the human person and so on. But that at least is part of, I think, what it's important to include here, that there's a kind of infinity to the icon that opens up to the divine. It opens to the divine in a way that enables the, I have to erase my L here so I have some space. Enables the icon, I'll get better at this, to measure us, right? So if the idol consigns the divine to human measure, then the icon measures us. It's the icon that gazes into us. The icon measures us. It provides the standard for us. So in encountering the icon of the living God, the icon of the invisible God, as St. Paul described it, what St. Paul is describing is, in my encounter with Christ, if I, let's say, read the Gospels, right, and I see the Gospels as iconic, as presenting a picture. And of course, this is something that could occur in a painting, statues, architecture even. But however it's mediated, I'm encountering something that goes beyond anything that I could have expected and anticipated, right? It's not that it just satisfies my aim or my intention. It doesn't just fulfill my gaze and freeze it and hold it, but rather it, as it were, tells me who I am, something that I didn't know before. And that, of course, also connects then with this first idea of it summoning us to surpass ourselves. And that's why I was kind of hesitating earlier about whether this belonged up here or down here, because I think they're both closely interrelated. This is connected to the idea, also important in Chrétien, that we're going to be looking at later on, to the idea of the call, which is also part of Levinas's idea of the face, that there's a kind of call or claim being made on me. I'm called to do something like this, right? So the icon in this sense is the exact reverse of the restrictive and merely human relative understanding of the divine that you find in the idol. And this is why I brought my Coke. Okay. Well, I think this is a very natural stopping point. I've more or less covered all the points I wanted to in this first chapter. So next time we'll go on to this other piece that I've also given you on Marion, which is more explicitly aesthetic and extending some of these general ideas to that. And we'll continue on in that way. So down below me here is, of course, the comment box. I'd like you to add a comment to this video. We'll have another one tomorrow and then a follow-up one on Wednesday of approximately the same length, and you should have a comment on each of these. I would also encourage you, please do engage in discussions with fellow classmates and others who comment on this. And hopefully we can, to some extent, simulate the seminar atmosphere that we've been deprived of by this rotten virus. So we'll see you again tomorrow.